Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in 2009, about a year after I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I faced so many questions from parents around the world, Catholic homeschooling parents, about classical Catholic education, about the classical liberal arts curriculum, and so on. There was no way for me to answer all of the individual questions, and at that time I was tutoring privately in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. That's really how the Classical Liberal Arts Academy started, and as they started telling friends and relatives, I started to have online contacts and interest from families all over the place. And as I said, I faced so many questions about the curriculum and the courses I was teaching that there was no way that I could possibly respond to the questions one by one, especially when they were all repeating the same questions and I was repeating all the same answers. So I decided to make an online course that was intended to provide homeschooling parents with lessons that explain to them the history and principles of real classical Catholic education. That was back in 2009, and many of the parents who enrolled students with me at that time studied that course, and that course allowed there to be a great deal of understanding between the parents and I, which I think benefited the students who were able to make pretty impressive progress in their studies. And over the years, it's been 13 years or so since then, that online teacher course was discontinued. We no longer offered it. And I could really feel the quality of interaction between parents and myself declining, because the parents, again, don't understand classical Catholic education, have all kinds of false ideas in their heads from other schools and programs about classical education and the history of Catholic education. And I realized that I had to get those lessons back in front of parents so that they could study and learn those things. So what I did was I dug up all of those old lessons, which I didn't even know I had them anymore, but I was able to dig them up, and I just threw them all together into a book form. There was no editing, there was no updates to those old lessons or anything. I just gathered all of those lessons together and put them in a book form and made that book available as a free PDF for parents to download and read. I did that maybe a year and a half ago. And since then, many families have been able to get a hold of that free book. And just to take a minute here, if you haven't seen that free book, if you go to classicalliberalaarts.com/free-book, just free-book, there's also a link on the menu on the website, but you can download a free copy of that book, which contains all of those old lessons that I had written for parents. It was 15 or 16 lessons, I don't remember. But when I collected all those old lessons and put them together, I made that available in book form for parents to use. And as I said, I didn't revise it or edit it or anything, and it was written 12 years ago or so. And since then, over those 12 years, my knowledge of classical Catholic education, as my research and work has continued, has really multiplied. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to revise and expand that old set of lessons and improve the quality of this book that's available for parents, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. I don't have time to sit down and work through this book on my own, just working through the text on a computer, because I have to continue to provide helpful content for parents who need that help now. And so what I've been thinking about, and my wife encouraged me in this because she thought it would be a good idea, is that I'd produce a series of videos where I walk through that old book. And again, it's really not a book, it's really just a collection of lessons, where I walk through those old lessons, read through that book in these videos, short videos, and just comment on the content and add to it, expand on that content. And then after I've done this and have a good sense of what this book should actually contain, maybe I'll start taking some time to put together a final revision of the book that's more valuable. So what we're going to do in these videos, none of this is planned, none of this is scripted. I'm just going to read through a portion of these lessons in this book from that old teacher training course, and I'm just going to comment whenever I have more to add to what the text states, especially in areas where I've been able to learn a lot more as a result of all the research that I've been able to do over the past 12 years. So that's what I'm going to be doing in these lessons, which are going to be titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education. Just walking through this book for my own sake, to read it and see what it contains, to refresh my memory of these old lessons, and also to comment and expand on it as much as I think is helpful, and make all of these videos available at no cost to Catholic parents to enjoy as I do this for my own sake. So we're just going to jump right in and get started here. This is chapter 1, the introduction of this book, and I'm going to move to the text here so you can read along with me. You can see here that we have chapter 1, the introduction, and this is straight out of that book, which you can download for free on the Academy website, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. So let's just read this first section in chapter 1, which provides an introduction. And you'll see that I read it pretty loosely because there's probably typos and things like that, because this text was never really revised or edited for print. Let's just begin with this reading and get started with the introduction. As we begin our study of the classical liberal arts, we will first consider the philosophy behind this ancient system of learning. We will see that modern educational philosophies are not alternatives to the ancient system, but errors leading men away from sound philosophy and ultimately from true happiness. We must understand, first of all, that as neither God, truth, nor man has ever changed, true education has never changed either. What has happened over time is that new forms of education have arisen as man or men have invented new philosophies of life or of the purpose of education. Thus, when Solomon says there is nothing new under the sun, he does not mean that men have not invented or cannot invent new errors. He means that as far as truth and happiness are concerned, nothing is new, and nothing will ever be new. This is a principle we must believe and reason from in our thinking about education. For the eternity and constancy of God and the truth that is in him provide the only source of peace and happiness in human life. Thus, when we consider man, body and soul, that element which is more like God, the soul, is that in which our happiness consists. And this must be the focus of true education. You may read this with no great surprise, but the errors in modern education are found right here. The denial of the eternal nature of man and the denial of the superiority of the soul. If you understand this and reason from these facts, you will soon come to see the errors of modern education and the wisdom of the classical liberal arts. So that's the opening to this first chapter, and obviously there's nothing that I would change, because the whole point of this opening passage is that true education is based on the formation of the soul, which has its end in God and lives by truth and for truth. And since God has not changed, the truth revealed by God, or the truth that exists in the world around us, has not changed. And we, human beings, our nature has not changed. Education, essential human education, can't possibly have changed. And therefore, when we do find changes in education, they must be changes for the worse. And this is the problem with modern education. I would add a few things to this opening, just by way of commentary. In the very first line, it says, as we begin our study of the classical liberal arts, we will first consider the philosophy behind this system of learning. If you think about education very simply, we take a child, or really anyone of any age who's beginning their education, and we seek to go from that starting point to some end point. That's all education is. We have some end point in view, and we seek to lead a student from where he or she is at the beginning to that end point. And so there's this assumption in all education that we know what the end point of education is. And I think we would all find that if I were to go around and ask people, what is the end point of education? We would get different answers from just about everyone. Many people would say something that sounds spiritual and nice and Christian, but it would be vague. Other people wouldn't even think of spiritual things, and they'd be talking about college admission and high school graduation and jobs and stuff like that. And this confusion with regard to the end of education explains all of the chaos when we talk about what education should look like. And so we have to understand that there is a philosophy that is behind the classical system of the classical liberal arts, which wise men and saints through history studied for the sake of that philosophy. That philosophy was the end, and the classical liberal arts were the steps that needed to be taken to reach that end. And if you were to say, I want that end, but not follow those steps, all of those wise men and saints would have told you that there's no other way to that wisdom except by these steps. And so what we're going to see as we study this book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, is that wisdom is what it is. Wisdom doesn't change. There's only one true philosophy that leads us to that true wisdom. And the wise men who actually attained that wisdom have told us what the steps are that lead us there. And anyone who says, nah, I'm not going to take those steps, I've got my own idea about how to get there, that person is a fool. The wise men who have attained it have told us how they attained it. And if we want to be wise, like the Proverbs teach us, then we have to walk with the wise men. He who walks with the wise shall become wise. Now, just to leap ahead and whet your appetite a little bit, I'd like you to know that in the book of Proverbs, it's chapter 9, verse 1, there's a verse that's mysterious for modern people to read. We read this verse, Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1, and it says, "Wisdom hath built herself a house, and hath hewn out for herself 7 pillars." Listen to that again. This is Proverbs 9:1, chapter 9, verse 1. "Wisdom hath built herself an house, and hath hewn out for herself 7 pillars." Now, if I were to present that proverb to modern school teachers, school administrators, college professors, anyone else working in education, homeschool parents, and most of all students, and ask them, what in the world is Solomon talking about? They would have no idea. Wisdom hath built herself a house, and hath hewn out for herself 7 pillars? What are we talking about? And yet, that's what we find written in the Old Testament Proverbs by King Solomon. Most people in education today, I would say almost all people in education today, would have no idea what that's talking about. And yet, in the Middle Ages, Saint Albert the Great, who was a doctor of the church, who was a teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, Saint Albert the Great said, with regard to that proverb, "The house that wisdom hath built is the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the 7 pillars are the 7 liberal arts." So in Catholic tradition, that proverb was understood to contain and reveal the true curriculum, the classical liberal arts curriculum. Wisdom hath hewn out, hath made for herself a house. The house, St. Albert says, is the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the 7 pillars are the 7 liberal arts. And we're going to study them as we go through this book. But what I want you to see is that from ancient times, Solomon lived 950 years before Christ. From ancient times, in sacred scripture, inspired by the Holy Spirit, wisdom was revealed to us. And the doctors of the church, or at least St. Albert the Great in this case, understood that in the scriptures was found instruction regarding Catholic education and the true way to wisdom, which was the 7 liberal arts, the 7 pillars that wisdom hath hewn out for herself. So that's the philosophy and the system of ancient learning that was understood throughout history to be revealed or hinted at or foreshadowed by Solomon, who himself didn't have that education because he didn't need it. Because if you remember, God gave him wisdom as a divine gift, as a grace. God gave him his wisdom. He prayed for that wisdom, and God answered his prayer and gave him that wisdom. But Solomon was able to tell us, according to the interpretation of Albert the Great, that the way to that wisdom for others is through the 7 pillars of wisdom, which St. Albert said are the 7 liberal arts. So there's a philosophy behind this ancient system of learning. And when we throw away that ancient system of learning, there's one of two options. Number one is that we don't care about that philosophy and we're going to seek something else, and therefore we have no interest in that ancient system of learning. That's option number one. We don't care about that philosophy. Option number two is we do care about that philosophy. We do want that true wisdom, but we think we have a different way. We think we know another way. So those two options exist for us when we see that ancient system of learning just pushed out of our schools and abandoned by Catholic people. Either we're not interested in that philosophy anymore, or we believe that we've got a better way to get there. I think it's pretty clear to all of us that we don't have a better way to get there than the wise men and doctors of the church themselves studied and taught. We don't have a better way to get there than the way that those who did get there told us we should take to get there, and that was the classical liberal arts. What we've done, in fact, is the other option. We have abandoned the pursuit of that philosophy and have simply turned our attention to other goals. And that's why our education no longer follows this system of the classical liberal arts. We're going to study that all through this book, so I'll leave it at that for now. But going on, we see more from Solomon. He says, there's nothing new under the sun, and we can be distracted by modern things. But again, this leads us, the interpretation of the passage, there's nothing new under the sun, leads us to a couple possible conclusions. Number one, Solomon was wrong, and there is new stuff under the sun. Maybe that's true. Maybe Solomon was just wrong. And today, he never could have foreseen the world of wireless internet and tablets and iPhones and all of this amazing stuff. Maybe Solomon spoke rashly and made an error here, and there is in fact lots of new stuff. Or that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about these technology fads, things that rise and fall, temporary things developed by men, and so on. But he's talking about the essential things of life. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, we are deceived by the technology around us because for most of us, it's been around our whole lives. I was never around in a day when people rode horses and buggies to get around town. I was never around when there were dirt roads. I was never around when there was no electricity or indoor plumbing. But if I were to go to my grandparents or great-grandparents, I would be able to talk to people who remember when there were no paved roads in the area, when there was no electricity in the house, when they had to use an outhouse out back, when they didn't have a telephone, or when the first telephone was installed. But for us, we can't even imagine life without these things. And what happens is we tend to think that they've just always been around. We can't imagine life without them. We think they've been here for a long, long time. And we think because they've been here for a long time, they must be here to stay. They must really be new things, changes in the world. And Solomon maybe didn't understand what was coming. But when we zoom out on world history, we find out that these things have barely been around for a century, and they may not be sustainable. Look at cars, for example. The first gas-powered automobile was invented when? Around 1900? So we're in 2022, and we're in, this apocalypse world that's talking about how we're going to run out of fuel and these cars are not sustainable and now we need electric cars and all this craziness. These automobiles have been around 100 years, and while a lot of that stuff is exaggerated, it's still true that this form of transportation may not be sustainable. It may be a blip on the radar of human history. And so we are the ones actually who are to question whether what appears to be new to us is in fact significant and lasting, or whether it's just a fad that's going to come and go, something that we really shouldn't be paying too much attention to. That's the kind of question I think that we need to ask. When Solomon, the wisest man of the ancient world, says that there's nothing new under the sun, and we say, oh yes, there is, maybe we're the ones who are thinking wrongly, and maybe he's trying to tell us something, to not be distracted by these things, but to focus on the things which never change, which were created by God, God himself, things that never change, things that are real, things that are true, and things that are lasting. Those are the things that wise men should be focused on. And this brings us back to the classical liberal arts educational system, which is focused on that which never changes. That's the essence of the real things that were pursued by wise men. So we have lots of errors. We have lots of new ideas and philosophies. We can start naming them. We can look at the Renaissance, look at the materialism that developed. We can look at the scientific revolution and Francis Bacon. We can look at Darwinism and theory of evolution. We can look at the naturalism of modern men like John Dewey. We can go through all of these different philosophical movements and developments that have occurred. And we can see these constantly changing philosophies that all aim at different ends. And when the end changes, the path to that end must necessarily change. And so education is always a servant of philosophy. And when the philosophy changes, when the end changes, the education changes. And when men want the end to change, the way that they bring that about is by changing the education. And so when we look at modern education and we compare it to ancient education, there are some things that really stand out. I did a video a while back in detail, if you're interested. It was what's the difference between modern and classical education, or modern and classical curriculum. And I showed that the modern curriculum looks pretty innocent until you compare it to the classical curriculum and notice what has been removed. The most important subject in the ancient curriculum is the art of reasoning, and it's not in modern education. The art of reasoning is not in modern education. It's hard to imagine that could ever happen, but it has happened, and not just in some kind of wild, liberal, pagan school. We're talking Christian schools. And we can have some goofy workbook that they bring in to try to teach fallacies, but that's not the art of reasoning. You can have a course and call it logic and do whatever you want, but that's not what the wise men meant by the art of reasoning. If we're going to study reasoning, we have to study the art of reasoning as the wise men understood it, and we don't do that. So we can look and say, how in the world could the art of reasoning be taken out of the curriculum? And this is especially important when we consider that St. Ignatius said the devil is a sophist. And how do you defeat the sophists? By the art of reasoning. It's no surprise then that if the devil wants to lead us away from the truth, he's going to have to get reasoning, the art of reasoning. He's going to have to get that out of the curriculum, and he has. Amazingly. It's almost impossible to comprehend, but it's true. So as men try to change the end, they also change the means of education. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see the educational system that was studied and taught by history's wisest and best men, the saints of our own church, the doctors of our own church. We shouldn't be surprised to see that educational system no longer found in schools. And the results of that change shouldn't surprise us either. That system produced results that we all know from history. And the changes and the new system that's been set in its place has failed to produce those results. And I'm not saying that those results are exclusively dependent on education or that education directly produces those results, because it's all God's grace. But when we look and we see that God's grace worked through that system of education to produce those results, and that same grace is available today, but is not working through this education to produce similar results, something appears to be wrong. The point of this first passage here, and I'll wrap this up, the point of this first passage is that the end of true education cannot change. God himself is wisdom. The knowledge of God is truth. Jesus said, I am the truth. And therefore, with that as our end, knowing God never changes, we never change. We're the same human race that God created in the beginning. We didn't change. The world we live in, as far as nature is concerned, the created world, that hasn't changed. God hasn't changed. The truth hasn't changed. Why then would education change? Why would education change if none of these things that have to do with the end of education have changed? It's strange. We can say that circumstances in the world around us change, and therefore, we need to do some different things to prepare. For example, Jesus didn't have to think about a university or college degree. To become a fisherman, Peter didn't necessarily have to have a license. There are all kinds of temporal, political and legal issues that come and go. Technological issues change. All sorts of superficial things to be dealt with. But the essence of education hasn't changed. And yet modern education is nothing like ancient education. And I try as hard as I can to communicate this to parents, but sometimes I feel like it's a waste of time, because this modern system has been around for several generations, and those who have been born under it cannot think of anything outside of it. And really, to be honest, they don't make any effort to think of anything outside of it. And yet, if we go back before the 1900s, back before, let's say, 1850s, this modern system of education didn't even exist. Didn't even exist. And so anyone who lived before the late 1800s had nothing to do with this modern K-12 public school, secular educational system. Name any saint. They had nothing to do with this education. I used to try to arouse the curiosity in my students by telling them that John Bosco never walked into a room and turned on a light switch, just to make them conscious of their place in history. St. Thomas Aquinas never sat down and started typing on a typewriter, never got in a car and took a ride, never walked into a bathroom and flushed a toilet. These things are new. And education is like those things. This education that we're familiar with, the saints didn't study like this. The doctors of the church that we talk about and love and admire, Saint Augustine, Saint Jerome, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Ambrose, Saint Bernard, we can go all through the history of Catholic education. They had nothing to do with this modern system of education. They studied the classical liberal arts. And of course, this system was perfected under St. Thomas Aquinas as he really perfected Catholic philosophy, scholastic philosophy. They knew no other system of education. When the Jesuits at the time of the Protestant Reformation got to work to preserve and promote classical Catholic education, they knew exactly what to do. They knew exactly what to restore, because there was only one thing that could ever be considered Catholic education, and that was the classical liberal arts. You can read it in the Ratio Studiorum that was published in 1599. The educational system, the only educational system that was known from before Christian times all through church history until modern times, the educational system that was never changed by the church itself, but was changed by movements outside the church and for some reason adopted in Catholic schools, was always the classical liberal arts, the classical Catholic curriculum that we have worked to restore and teach in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's based on that end which never changes. And if the education changes, we have to ask, have we abandoned that true end of education? Or have we found a way there that the doctors of the church and wise men didn't themselves understand? And I certainly don't think that's the truth. We've abandoned that end. We've been distracted by short-sighted concerns and anxieties in education, and the education that we now have is no longer directed at that chief end of man, which is to know, love, and serve God with a view to happiness in eternity. And so as we go through this book, we're going to study the history of education from ancient times, ancient Egyptian times, all the way through Greece and Rome, ancient Israel, into the Christian era and all through Christian history until we see the modern changes, where they came from, what they changed and why, and can rightly understand what's going on in modern education. So we have a lot to study. That's just the first 2 paragraphs of the introduction that we've talked about and have already spent 38 minutes thinking about. But we have a lot to study and talk about. I'm going to go through this book passage by passage as my time allows, and I'll keep all of these together in a playlist on the Academy YouTube channel, and I invite everyone to give them a listen, give the book a read. It's free on the Academy website, and communicate with me. Let's talk through these things and think about what's going on in modern education, what's changed and why it's changed, and most importantly, what we need to do as Catholics to fix it, because ultimately that's the challenge we face. Not to sit around and criticize things, but to actually fix them. I just read yesterday in a book I was reading that the best form of criticism, or the best way to criticize something, is to make something better. Let's try to do that. Let's try to have a positive mindset, an active mindset, not critical, not negative, not sitting around fussing, but a mindset that looks to restore and renew and make something better. I hope that's helpful. God bless.